You'd never expect that a simple cardboard box on the side of the road could be the line between life and loss. That morning, as thick fog strangled the streets of Pine Hollow, an old dog, one people thought had stopped hearing, stopped seeing, suddenly froze. Then he barked. Not in fear. But because somewhere in that silence, there was a faint breath begging to be heard. No one else stopped. No one else noticed. But Shadow did. And in that single moment, he held on to something that could change an entire life. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about instinct, about love without condition, and about how one loyal soul heard what the whole world ignored. If you believe that sometimes, all it takes to save a life is a heart that doesn't turn away, like this video, subscribe, and stay. Because what happened next, might just change the way you look at a dog forever. The town of Pine Hollow sat tucked between the folds of low Vermont hills, its rooftops blanketed with a soft layer of snow, the kind that softened every sound and turned even the busiest corners into quiet sketches. It was the last Monday before Christmas, and the sky hung heavy with a pale gray fog, as if the clouds themselves had forgotten how to move. Everything was still, until the barking started. Deputy Mark Collier zipped his thick department-issued jacket a little higher and shoved his gloved hands deeper into his pockets. The cold bit through the seams of everything lately. He walked slowly along Maple Street, boots crunching the salt-dusted sidewalk, a leash in one hand. At the other end of the leash was Shadow. Shadow was a 10-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat dusted with flecks of white now, not just from the snow. His ears, once always alert and taut, drooped slightly in a way that made him look perpetually thoughtful. He had served 6 years in the K-9 unit before retiring 2 winters ago. Since then, he had moved a bit slower, but no one, not even Mark, doubted that the instincts remained razor-sharp beneath the aging frame. Mark, in his early 40s, was lean, with a weather-worn face and eyes that often scanned more than stared. Years of quiet service had etched subtle creases at the edges of his mouth, not from smiling too much, but from holding back what didn't need to be said. He had been widowed 3 years ago in a highway accident that took his wife during an ice storm. Since then, solitude had become less of a choice and more of a routine. Shadow was the one constant he let stay. They walked this route every Monday at dawn, the hour when the world felt too quiet to be anything but honest. Today, the fog seemed heavier, the kind that turned familiar roads into hushed mysteries. As they approached the intersection with Elm Street, the low rumble of a truck echoed around the corner. It was the Hands of Hope pickup, a weathered navy blue box truck with a dented bumper and a painted logo fading from years of sun and snow. The driver, Harold Greeley, stepped out, stocky, bearded, and always smelling faintly of coffee and old wool. He'd driven this route for the local donation center for nearly a decade and knew almost every porch box in town by heart. "Morning, Deputy," Harold called, lifting one hand in a lazy wave. "Cold one, huh?" Mark nodded, half smiling. "Stay warm, Harold." But before another word could pass, Shadow froze. The leash jerked taut in Mark's hand. His ears shot up, tail stiffened, body crouched low, ready, tense. Then he growled. Not a casual grumble, but a deep, guttural vibration that cut through the fog. Mark stopped. "Shadow." The dog surged forward with a sudden bark, charging toward the edge of the sidewalk where several donation boxes had been set out. One of them, a large cardboard box with frayed corners, rocked slightly from the vibration of the passing truck. Harold, about to lift it onto the lift gate, startled. "Whoa, buddy. What's got him stirred?" Mark caught up, grabbed Shadow's collar, and tried to steady him. The dog barked again, louder this time. Urgent. Focused. "Shadow, easy, boy," Mark said, dropping to a knee. But Shadow wasn't just alarmed. He was fixated. Mark's gaze moved to the box. It was large, sealed loosely with twine, corners softened by snow. Something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't the box itself, but the air around it. Still, charged, expectant. "Harold," Mark said quietly. "Don't lift that yet." He reached into his coat for a small folding knife and sliced the twine. The lid, once removed, released a wave of cold air, and something else. A faint sound. Like breath catching in a bottle. Mark peeled back the top layer of old flannel and froze. Inside, barely visible beneath layers of towels and fabric scraps, was a baby. A boy, no older than a day. His skin was tinged blue. His tiny fists curled tight, lips slightly parted, chest rising in shallow gasps. Mark's world narrowed. Sound fell away. All he could hear was Shadow's breath beside him and the soft, almost inaudible cry of a life hanging by threads. "Call EMS," he barked. "Now." Harold fumbled for his phone, fingers trembling. Mark stripped off his jacket, wrapping the infant with practiced hands, bringing the small body close to his own. He could feel the cold leaching from the child's skin. Shadow stood close, nose near the baby, unmoving. "You did good, boy," Mark whispered. The ambulance arrived in under 6 minutes. But those minutes were a lifetime. Mark sat on the edge of the truck bed, cradling the infant, whispering softly, trying to keep the baby awake. "Stay with me, little guy. You're okay. You're safe now." The paramedics moved quickly, oxygen, warming blankets, soft voices laced with urgency. As they took the baby inside, one of them turned to Mark. "If you hadn't found him when you did." Mark just nodded. He couldn't speak. Shadow remained beside him, eyes still watching the empty box. The street had returned to its quiet self, fog wrapping around the houses like a hush. Mark looked down at Shadow. "You always know, don't you?" The dog didn't move, only blinked once, slow and knowing. Later that morning, after the baby had been stabilized at the Pine Hollow Regional Medical Center and the official statements had been filed, Mark and Shadow walked back along the same sidewalk. The donation boxes were gone. Only tire tracks and melting snow remained. But something lingered. Something unspoken. Mark paused, hand resting on Shadow's head. His thoughts went to the infant's mother, whoever she was. What had led her to this choice? Was it desperation, hope, fear? He didn't know. Not yet. But what he did know, beyond question, was this. A dog had heard what no one else could. And because of that, a cry in the cold hadn't gone unheard. By the time the clock struck 10 a.m., the frost on the windows of Pine Hollow Regional Medical Center had begun to melt, revealing the pale outlines of the wintry world outside. The sky remained a dull pewter gray, with soft snowflakes descending like ash. Inside the neonatal unit, warmth hummed gently through the vents, and the sterile quiet was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional soft murmur of a nurse. Wrapped in layers of warm cotton, the infant found in the cardboard box now slept inside an incubator. His breathing was shallow but steady, and the faint blue tinge in his lips had begun to fade. The nurses had given him a temporary name, Noah, a soft name that carried a strange kind of hope, like he'd already survived a flood. Deputy Mark Collier stood by the window of the neonatal room, arms folded across his chest, his brow tense with questions he couldn't yet answer. His dark jacket hung open, the inner lining still damp from the cold, and his badge caught the light every time he shifted slightly in thought. Beside him stood Denise, a senior nurse in her mid-50s, with short curly gray hair and a comforting presence. She was sturdy and motherly, her voice as even as her hands. "He was lucky," she said, glancing at the monitors. "No frostbite, no signs of trauma. Cold stress, yes, but his vitals are coming up. He just needs holding now." Mark didn't reply right away. His eyes were fixed on the baby, but his mind was back in that freezing alley, on the way Shadow had barked with such urgency, on the way the child's lips had barely moved. He thought of what could have happened, if they'd walked a minute later, if the fog had been thicker, if Shadow had stopped trusting his instincts. Then Denise handed him a plastic evidence bag. Inside it was a wrinkled note, its edges crinkled from damp and cold. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places. It read, "I'm sorry. I love him more than myself. Please take care of him." Mark stared at the note in silence, letting the weight of those words settle into him. They weren't scribbled without care. They had the tremble of heartbreak in them. Of desperation and love tangled so tightly they couldn't be separated. A moment later, the door to the neonatal unit opened. Dr. Leland Shaw stepped in, pulling off a pair of latex gloves. He was tall, slender, in his early 60s, with a neatly trimmed beard and spectacles that sat low on his nose. Always calm, sometimes too calm for Mark's taste, but never unkind. "Deputy Collier," Dr. Shaw greeted him with a slight nod. "You found him?" Mark nodded once. "My K9 partner did, actually." "Shadow." Dr. Shaw gave a soft hum of approval. "Well, he's a strong one, this boy. He wouldn't have lasted another hour out there. Whoever left him behind, chose a time and place someone might find him. It doesn't excuse it, but it's something." Mark looked down at the note again. "Any chance the paper could tell us more?" Shaw shrugged slightly. "Forensics might get fingerprints. But given how wet it was, I wouldn't get your hopes up." As if on cue, Shadow entered the hallway just outside the room, his large frame silhouetted against the fluorescent lights. 10 years old, with a black and tan coat now dusted with gray around the muzzle and hind legs, the German Shepherd still carried himself with quiet authority. His deep eyes scanned the space, then landed on Mark. His tail gave a single thump. He sat. Mark walked out to him. "Still got that scent?" Shadow stood immediately. He sniffed the air again, his body alert, not tense, but purposeful. Mark looked back at Denise and Dr. Shaw. "I'll be back." Together, man and dog stepped out into the biting cold. East Pine Hollow was less picturesque than its postcard-perfect downtown. The buildings were lower, older, flanked with leaning fences and narrow alleys. Mark drove slowly, letting the window down an inch despite the wind. Every so often, he held the damp piece of fabric found with the baby near Shadow's nose. The dog sniffed, then pointed slightly left with a gentle nudge of his head. That's how they ended up outside a faded, mustard-yellow apartment building near the edge of the industrial park, an area known more for day laborers and second-shift warehouse workers than young families. It was the kind of place where broken porch lights stayed broken, where people left their shoes inside the door not out of habit, but out of fear they'd be taken. They walked up slowly. A woman was stepping out, locking her door. She looked to be in her 20s, with dark skin and long braids pulled into a thick bun. She wore a faded hoodie and sweatpants, and clutched a thermos to her chest. Her expression was weary, but not unfriendly. "You looking for someone?" she asked as she noticed the uniform and the dog. "Just asking a few questions," Mark said gently. "You live here long?" She shook her head. "Couple months. I keep to myself, mostly. Work nights. Don't see much." Shadow moved past her, sniffing the railing. His tail stiffened, and he pulled gently toward the basement stairwell around the side of the building. Mark followed. At the bottom was a door, number 1B. Faint scuff marks on the concrete. A plastic grocery bag tied to the knob, torn and empty. Shadow sat beside it and waited. Mark didn't knock. Not yet. He took a step back and scanned the doorframe. Taped to the inside of the window was another piece of lined paper, hastily torn. He squinted through the grime and frost. No writing. Just a faint red mark, like someone had started a note and never finished it. He turned back to Shadow, lowering his voice. "Think she lived here?" Shadow only blinked, ears still. Mark didn't push further. He needed a warrant or a resident willing to talk. For now, he took a photo of the door and the note, then slipped away quietly, heart heavier than before. Somewhere in this building, or somewhere very nearby, was a mother who had written, "I love him more than myself." And then walked away. The wind picked up again that afternoon in Pine Hollow, sweeping across the sidewalks like a memory that refused to be buried. Snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained low and dim, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. The small grocery store on Maple Avenue sat wedged between a pawn shop and a shuttered barber's, its cracked window taped in one corner and a rusted bell above the door that jingled half a second too late. Deputy Mark Collier stood inside the store, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on a small monitor behind the cashier counter. The store smelled of instant coffee, old onions, and bleach. The man beside him, Greg Sandler, had owned the place for 15 years. He was balding, with a round belly and thick glasses that slid down his nose every time he spoke. Greg was one of those men who seemed irritated by everything but still cared deeply about the town he lived in. Cameras motion triggered, Greg muttered, clicking through the playback. Only records 30 seconds at a time. This one's from yesterday, around 6:30 a.m. That's when the truck came for the donation pickup, right? Mark nodded, jaw tight. The grainy footage flickered, then settled. The angle showed the store's front sidewalk, where a row of donation bins stood against the wall. A figure entered from the left, small, hunched, dressed in a bulky olive-green puffer jacket that had seen better days. A knitted beanie was pulled low, almost covering her eyes. She carried a large cardboard box in both arms, clutching it to her chest like something precious and fragile. She looked over her shoulder once. Then placed the box gently beside the bin and stepped back. Her movements were slow, hesitant, as if she were saying goodbye. Mark leaned closer. The woman turned slightly toward the camera just before walking away, and for a moment, her face came into focus, pale, drawn, with sharp cheekbones and lips cracked from the cold. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep with exhaustion, but there was something unmistakable in them, grief wrapped around love like frost around a rose. "I know her," Mark said quietly. Greg looked over his shoulder. "You do?" "Ellie Bennett," Mark confirmed. "Used to work part-time at Millie's Bakery, out near the train tracks. 22, maybe 23. Last I heard, her boyfriend left town right after she got pregnant." Greg sighed through his nose. "Poor kid. Never saw her smile once, come to think of it." Mark barely heard him. His mind had already shifted gears. "Do you still have her address on file?" Greg scratched his chin. "Might be on an old payroll stub, hang on." 10 minutes later, Mark was driving toward the east side of town again. The neighborhoods here were rougher, more weathered. Rows of cheap apartments leaned against one another like drunks after last call. It was the kind of place where people stopped asking questions because the answers hurt too much. He parked in front of a gray, two-story building with a sagging porch and faded siding. Apartment 2A was listed under her name. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath his boots. At the door, he paused. From inside, there was no sound, no television, no crying, no movement. He knocked once. Then again, louder. No answer. Shadow, who had been waiting patiently in the car, stood at the base of the stairs now, watching intently. Mark looked back at him, and the dog tilted his head, nose lifting toward the cold wind. Mark knocked a third time. This time, a voice replied, barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" "Ellie." Mark called gently. "It's Deputy Collier. From the station. I'd like to talk." A pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Just a few inches. The woman behind it looked smaller than she had in the video. Her frame was thin, swallowed by a large sweater with sleeves chewed at the cuffs. Her hair, a dull chestnut brown, was tied in a loose bun that had mostly unraveled. She wore no makeup, and her cheeks were flushed, not with health, but with cold and fatigue. Ellie Bennett had always been quiet, Mark remembered her now, serving coffee behind the bakery counter, barely speaking unless someone spoke to her first. She had that nervous softness some people carried like a second skin, as if constantly apologizing for taking up space. But now, that same softness looked more like fragility. "Please," she said, eyes wide, "I didn't want to hurt him." Mark held up a calming hand. "No one's accusing you. Noah's alive. He's at the hospital, stable. You did the right thing bringing him somewhere he'd be found." At the name, her lips trembled. She looked down. "I couldn't keep him warm anymore," she whispered. "The heater broke a week ago. I called the landlord, but he didn't come. I tried. I wrapped him in towels, held him all night. But he kept getting colder. He stopped crying. I thought," her voice cracked, "I thought he was dying." Mark's voice was quiet. "So you brought him to the donation bins." "I didn't know where else to go," she said, eyes filling. "No family. No job. The bakery let me go after Christmas. I didn't even have a phone plan. I just wanted someone to find him before it was too late." Behind her, the apartment was dim. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a few empty bottles of formula, a cracked space heater with a broken dial, and a pile of baby clothes folded neatly in the corner. Mark exhaled slowly. "Can I come in?" he asked. She hesitated. Then nodded. As he stepped inside, Shadow came to sit by the door. Ellie looked at the dog, startled at first, but then her eyes softened. "That's him," she whispered. "He was the one who barked, wasn't he?" Mark nodded. "He doesn't miss much." She crouched down, slowly, and held out a hand. Shadow sniffed her fingers, then leaned into her palm. For the first time since he arrived, Ellie smiled. It was faint. Fragile. But real. The snow had begun to soften by the time Deputy Mark Collier stepped out of the worn apartment complex, leaving Ellie Bennett behind a half-open door and a hollow echo of guilt she could no longer carry alone. The street outside was quiet, layered in a hush that only winter could bring. Shadow followed at his heel, tail low, eyes flicking toward the second-story window above them, as if still tethered to the girl and the silence she lived in. Mark didn't speak during the drive. The sun had begun to dip behind the pine hills to the west, casting the narrow streets of Pine Hollow in a dusky lavender hue. He didn't drive back to the station. Not yet. Instead, he turned onto a road that wound gently toward the outskirts of town, where rows of modest homes stood behind low fences and overgrown hedges, their mailboxes leaning tiredly to one side. He stopped in front of a white wooden fence that creaked gently in the wind. The house beyond it was small, with peeling green shutters and smoke curling lazily from a crooked chimney. An old swing hung from the porch ceiling, swaying slightly though no one sat in it. This was where Sarah lived. Sarah Whitmore had been a foster mother in Pine Hollow for over 20 years. She was in her early 60s now, tall and lean, with silver hair that she always tied back with a faded red scarf. Her clothes were practical, always soft sweaters and denim jeans, and her hands were always busy, either kneading bread or replanting something in the garden even in winter. She had once lost a child of her own, a boy named Jacob, who had died in a car crash on his 12th birthday. Since then, she had taken in children like she was healing something inside her by helping others survive. Sarah was placing firewood into a metal rack on her porch when Mark arrived. She looked up as Shadow jumped out of the cruiser and trotted toward her, his paws silent against the snow. She smiled gently and bent down to greet him. "I figured I'd see you today," she said before Mark even spoke. He gave a small nod, stepping through the gate. "You always did have good timing." Sarah stood, brushing off her gloves. "Let me guess. A young mother. No place left to turn. A baby she didn't know how to save, but couldn't bear to let go." Mark exhaled slowly. "You nailed it." He told her about Ellie, about the broken heater, the note left in the box, the way she hadn't asked for forgiveness, only for the boy to be okay. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands resting lightly on the top rail of the fence. When he finished, she looked toward the fading sky and said, "Bring her here." Mark blinked. "You take her." "I won't leave her out in the cold," she said simply. "And the baby too, when he's ready. I've got a spare room. Heat works. The neighbors are quiet. And I still believe in second chances." Shadow sat beside her now, leaning slightly into her leg. Mark glanced down the road, uncertain. She might not come willingly. Sarah shrugged. "Then we wait." He didn't return to Ellie's apartment until the next morning. The town had frozen overnight, and patches of black ice made the roads shine like mirrors. He knocked once more on the old wooden door. Ellie opened it this time without asking who it was. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, but her shoulders had less of that defeated slope they'd held the day before. "You came back," she said, like it surprised her. Mark gave a small smile. "I brought something." He stepped aside, and Shadow padded forward, tail swishing slightly. The dog looked up at Ellie, then walked past her, straight to the mattress in the corner where Noah's tiny clothes still lay. He lay down beside it and sighed. Ellie watched, her hands trembling. "I know you think there's no way out," Mark said gently. "But there is. There's a woman named Sarah. She has a home with heat. A safe place. She lost a child once, and never stopped believing that no one should go through that kind of pain alone. She said she'd take you in. No questions. Just warmth. And time." Ellie covered her mouth with one hand. She stepped back, her legs unsteady, and sank onto the edge of the mattress. "I wasn't trying to give him up," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to keep him alive." Mark nodded. "You kept him alive long enough for someone else to find him. That counts." Shadow lifted his head and inched closer, resting his muzzle against her foot. Ellie looked down at him, eyes welling again. She reached out slowly, brushing her fingers through the dog's thick coat. "He didn't bark because he was scared," she said softly. "He barked because he knew." "Didn't he?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that afternoon, Ellie stepped out into the snow with nothing but a duffel bag and a quiet nod. Shadow walked beside her, their paces matching, as Mark led them both back toward the white fence, toward something that wasn't quite home, but could be. As Sarah opened the front door and Ellie crossed the threshold, she paused. "Thank you," she said, voice cracking. Sarah didn't reply right away. She simply held the door open wider and said, "Come in, child. No need to thank me. Just breathe. Just rest." And with that, Ellie stepped inside. Shadow curled up by the fireplace that evening, his ears twitching gently in sleep. The snow outside began to fall again, quietly covering old footprints and softening the edges of everything it touched. Inside, something had started to thaw, not just Ellie's hands, but her heart. The cold had returned overnight, sharper now, biting into the bones of Pine Hollow like a quiet warning that winter had not yet finished its story. Frost glazed every windowpane and turned the brittle grass silver beneath pale light. It was in this breathless silence that Mark Collier stood in front of a weather-worn gate, one hand resting on the top rail, the other buried deep in the pocket of his jacket. Behind the gate was a house he hadn't stepped into for 3 years. The house was modest, 2 stories tall with cracked stucco and paint peeling off the shutters in strips. The chimney smoked faintly, a sign of life still flickering inside, but the yard was neglected, patches of overgrown weeds clawed through the snow like forgotten regrets. The name etched on the faded mailbox read, Walter Brennan. Walter was not just a man from Mark's past, he was the shadow of a fracture that had never quite healed. In his early 70s, Walter was tall, broad-shouldered despite the stoop that time had forced upon him. His once black hair had turned completely white, trimmed short and neat, and he still wore the same style of thick flannel shirts and leather suspenders, like a uniform for grief that he never stopped donning. He had once loved Mark like a son, until the accident that took his daughter, Amelia. Since then, Walter had spoken to Mark only once, and even that was laced with ice. Mark took a breath, opened the gate, and stepped up to the porch. Shadow padded quietly beside him, each paw print a whisper against the snow-dusted boards. The old man opened the door before Mark could knock. Walter's eyes were the same pale blue as Amelia's had been, though theirs had always sparkled with warmth. His now were rimmed with years of cold. "Didn't expect to see you," he said. His voice was deep, slow, rough from age and silence. "I wouldn't be here unless it mattered," Mark replied, standing straight. "It's not about me." Walter's gaze flicked to Shadow, then back to Mark. "I need to ask something of you," Mark continued. "There's a girl. Her name is Ellie. She's 22. No family. No job. No home. But she has a baby, Noah. She did everything she could to keep him alive, even when she had nothing left. She nearly froze trying." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she's running out of places to land," Mark said. "Sarah's taken her in for now. But it's not permanent. She needs someone stable. Someone who won't walk away when things get hard. Someone who's already lost too much not to understand what's at stake." Walter didn't respond. Mark stepped closer. "If you don't take her in," he said quietly, "she may have to give up her child again. And this time, there might not be a second chance." For a moment, the porch fell into a silence so tight that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Walter looked past Mark, toward the frost-covered trees beyond the road. Then, with a voice that cracked just once, he asked, "Why me?" "Because," Mark said, eyes steady, "you know what it feels like to lose someone you love and not be able to change a damn thing about it. But this is something you can change." Walter didn't speak. He didn't invite Mark inside. He just stepped back and closed the door softly, not a slam, not an ending. A pause. Mark didn't expect an answer right away. The following morning, as Sarah stirred eggs in a pan and Ellie sat by the fire with a blanket pulled over her lap, there was a knock on the door. Shadow, who had been dozing, stood immediately and padded to the threshold, ears up but relaxed. Sarah opened the door to find no person, only a rolled-up piece of paper placed carefully atop the doormat. She picked it up and unrolled it. It was a child's drawing done in crayon. The lines were clumsy, but clear enough: a snowy street, a large dog lying beside a cardboard box, and above them, a sky full of soft stars. In the corner was a figure of a small baby, wrapped in blue, sleeping. Sarah showed it to Ellie. Ellie pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's Shadow. That's the box." "Look," Sarah said gently, pointing to a name scribbled in block letters on the back of the page. "Walter." Later that day, Walter arrived. He didn't come with words. Instead, he came with his old red truck, its engine rumbling like a bear half asleep. He wore a navy scarf, and in his hand, he held a tiny wooden carving of a cradle. He had made it years ago for a child who never got the chance to use it. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on Sarah's porch. Ellie stood in the doorway, watching him. "I don't know how to raise a baby," Walter said, eyes meeting hers. "But I know how to show up. If you'll let me try." Ellie didn't speak. Her arms wrapped tighter around the blanket. Then, slowly, she nodded. Shadow stepped between them and sat, eyes flicking from one face to the other. Walter bent down and placed a hand on the dog's head. "He's the one who brought you back to me, isn't he?" he murmured. Sarah watched from inside the window, one hand on the frame, smiling faintly. Something in the air had shifted, not melted, not yet warm, but loosened, like the snow before a thaw. The first snow of February fell softly on the town of Pine Hollow, blanketing rooftops in silence and layering tree branches with glistening white lace. Shelterwood, formerly a boarding house, now a modest transitional shelter for women and children, stood at the edge of a pine grove, its brick walls worn but sturdy, like an old man who had seen war but still stood watch. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and baby powder. The floors creaked. The radiator hissed. And in the far corner of the nursery, baby Noah was stirring in his sleep. It was a quiet afternoon when Walter Brennan first came to Shelterwood. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask to speak to anyone. He walked slowly through the front gate, gripping a paper bag in his gloved hands, his breath fogging in the cold. He wore the same threadbare brown coat he always had, its elbows faded, and a scarf tucked under his collar. His boots left deep prints in the snow. Sarah had arranged with the shelter's coordinator, a kind woman named Leah Morrison, for Walter to be allowed brief, quiet visits. Leah was in her early 40s, warm and round-faced, with soft curly hair tucked beneath a knitted beanie. She had a gentle way of speaking and often hummed lullabies even when she wasn't holding a child. Walter nodded to her at the door, and she stepped aside, saying only, "He's down the hall, last crib on the right." In the paper bag was a small woolen hat, soft gray, with a tiny blue button sewn on the brim. The yarn was slightly stretched, the stitches loose in places. It had been hand-knit by Walter's late wife, Margaret, back when their daughter Amelia was only a few months old. He had kept it all these years in a small cedar box, never touched, wrapped in an old towel like a relic. And now, for reasons he couldn't explain out loud, he needed someone else to wear it. Walter stepped into the nursery and paused. There were 3 cribs, 2 bassinets, and a soft chair beneath a window. The room was warm, filled with the rustle of soft blankets and the occasional hiccuping breath of dreaming infants. Noah was in the crib near the window, wrapped in a yellow swaddle, his face still slightly flushed from crying earlier. Walter approached slowly, like someone approaching a memory they weren't sure would forgive them. He bent down and placed the little hat beside the baby's blanket. He didn't try to put it on. He simply left it there. A silent offering. A beginning. From that day on, Walter came every afternoon, just before dusk. He rarely spoke. He didn't coo or bounce or baby talk. Instead, he sat in the chair by the window, removed his coat with stiff movements, and folded it neatly on his lap. Then he would sit and listen, to the creaks of the floor, the sighs of the radiator, the quiet gurgles of a waking child. Sometimes Noah cried. Sometimes he smiled. Walter never flinched at either. On the 5th visit, Noah reached out with a clumsy, mittened hand and touched Walter's knuckles. The old man stared at the tiny fingers, then slowly turned his palm upward, letting the baby grasp it. He didn't say a word. But something in his shoulders shifted, less like a burden dropped, more like a weight he was finally strong enough to carry. Ellie, still fragile in her healing, often watched from the doorway. At first, she had resented the silence between them, how Walter never said what he meant, never offered her the validation she didn't know she was waiting for. But watching how gently he sat, how patiently he returned each day, Ellie began to understand. Some people didn't know how to speak love aloud. They only knew how to return. And stay. Sarah visited occasionally, bringing hot meals or knitted socks for the shelter's children. She would sit beside Ellie and talk in low tones, letting the young woman lead the pace of the conversation. Sarah knew better than to force growth, she believed in watering what could bloom when it was ready. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside and snow drifted sideways across the windows, Walter arrived soaked to the knees, but still holding a book in one hand. It was a children's story, softcover, old, with torn edges. The Dog Who Waited by the Door. He sat beside Noah's crib, opened the book, and began to read. His voice was gruff, slow, but even. The words came like warm gravel rolling down a hillside. And the dog stayed, through winter and rain, until the door opened again. Shadow, who had accompanied Walter this time, sat curled in the corner, his graying fur rising and falling with each breath. He had grown slower these days, his steps more deliberate, his eyes more watchful. But he still followed Walter without question, just as he had followed Mark through fog and fear weeks ago. As Walter read, Ellie stepped into the room and stood beside the crib. She said nothing for a long time. Just listened. When he closed the book, she finally spoke. "Why this one?" Walter didn't look up. "Because it's not about the dog. It's about the waiting." Ellie nodded. Then, gently, she picked up the hat that now sat neatly on a hook beside Noah's crib. She turned it over in her hands. "I used to think letting go meant failure," she said quietly. "But maybe, staying is the harder part." Walter met her gaze for the first time. His eyes were tired. But not empty. "That hat belonged to someone who never gave up," he said. "And I think, she would have liked to see it used again." Ellie gave a small, tearful smile. She placed the hat on Noah's head, adjusting it until it fit snugly. And for the first time in days, Noah laughed, a bright, sudden sound that echoed through the nursery like sunlight through frost. Walter didn't smile. But his hands tightened around the book, and he let out a long, quiet breath. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened. The sky opened a little. And somewhere between sorrow and stillness, something new began to grow. The town of Pine Hollow was awash in twinkling lights and distant carols as dusk settled gently on Christmas Eve. Shop windows glowed with warm displays of pine wreaths and red ribbons, and laughter floated up from sidewalks dusted with fresh snow. Children bundled in thick coats clutched their parents' hands, dragging sleds behind them and tossing snowballs toward lamp posts. The whole town seemed to pulse with light and song. But just 2 streets away from the town square, Shelterwood remained hushed, like a chapel of soft sighs. No garlands adorned its doorway. No bells jingled from the handle. But inside, in a small upstairs room dimly lit by a night lamp, something more sacred than festivity was taking place. Ellie sat in the worn armchair by the window, wrapped in a faded cream shawl that had once belonged to a woman who had known how to sew peace into fabric. In her arms, Noah slept, his tiny chest rising and falling with the deep stillness only infants seem to know. The soft lull of his breath seemed to calm her own. Her eyes were puffy, but not from sadness, only the gentle exhaustion that came from being fully present in a moment that mattered. Beneath the crib, Shadow lay curled into himself. His body, grizzled with age and experience, was pressed against the warm wooden frame of the crib like a silent sentry. He had been there nearly every night for the past week, ever since Ellie and Walter had agreed to give the arrangement a trial run. It wasn't official yet, but it felt real. Ellie was beginning to trust the rhythm again: feed, hold, sleep, listen. Trust that no one was leaving this time. The door creaked open quietly. Mark stepped inside, snow clinging to the cuffs of his boots, and the cold following him like a breath he hadn't yet exhaled. He was dressed in plain clothes, not his deputy's uniform, just jeans, a dark sweater, and a look in his eyes that was softer than usual. Mark had grown more still lately. After the firestorm of that first week, the discovery, the search, the confrontation, the impossible choices, he'd found a quiet lane to walk. The guilt still stirred, as it always did, but the corners of it had softened. He had begun to learn that sometimes presence was more powerful than penance. Ellie looked up when he entered, but didn't stand. She simply shifted Noah slightly and offered a small nod. Mark smiled and stepped forward. In his hands was a simple brown box tied with twine. No shiny paper. No card. Just a humble offering that seemed to match the energy of the room. He set it gently on the side table beside Ellie and knelt next to Shadow. The dog stirred slightly but didn't lift his head. He knew Mark, trusted him. "Thought he might like this," Mark said softly, placing a hand on the dog's thick neck. Ellie glanced at the box. "What is it?" Mark didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled the twine loose, opened the lid, and removed a soft, handmade collar. It was a thick, woven strip of burlap, carefully stitched along the edges, and at the center, a small patch of blue thread had been embroidered with steady hands. It read, "Shadow, my first hero." The silence that followed was reverent. Ellie looked down at Shadow, who remained still, his ears twitching slightly as if he understood something unspoken. Mark set the collar gently next to him. "He's earned it," he said. "I know," Ellie replied. In the corner of the room, the radiator hissed once, then settled. The only other sounds were the rhythm of Noah's breathing and the slow, steady thump of Shadow's tail against the floor. Ellie ran her fingers lightly over the stitching. Her voice was barely audible. "Thank you." Mark sat back against the edge of the crib, letting his legs stretch out. He looked at Noah, at the peaceful expression on Ellie's face, at the old dog curled like a comma between stories. "This isn't the Christmas I expected," he said. Ellie smiled, the edges of her mouth lifting slowly, deliberately. "Me neither." Mark tilted his head slightly. "Better or worse?" She looked around the room, eyes lingering on each detail, the baby in her arms, the threadbare curtains that fluttered slightly with the wind, the gift on the table. "Quieter," she said. But somehow, more true. No one spoke after that. There was no need. Outside, the streets filled with holiday music and the scent of fireplaces burning bright. But in this little room above Shelterwood, the real miracle of the night unfolded in silence, where no grand gestures were needed, and no stage was built. Only warmth. Only breath. Only the kind of peace that arrives when you're not looking for it, but know to keep it close when it comes. Shadow shifted in his sleep, his head now resting atop the collar, as if claiming it not just with pride, but with understanding. And the light in the room flickered gently, like the heart of a story that still had many pages left to turn. Snowflakes drifted like quiet prayers over the rooftops of Pine Hollow as the year drew to a close. It wasn't the kind of blizzard that halted things, nor the kind that made the roads treacherous, it was gentler, like the sky was sending down its own form of closure, one flake at a time. The air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the only sound in the square was the occasional crunch of boots from townsfolk heading home after the town's modest end-of-year celebration. There had been no grand stage this year, no blaring speakers or fireworks. Instead, the town council had chosen something quieter. More fitting. At the corner of Main and Rosewood, just outside the red brick town library, a simple wooden plaque now hung beneath the wrought iron arch carved carefully by hand. It bore no flashy decoration. Just a single line in clean serif letters. Shadow, the dog who listened. It had been unanimously approved, no need for debate. After all, no one had forgotten the story. Not the morning Shadow had barked through the fog. Not the baby found. Not the way he had slept beside a frightened young woman and her child every night since. And certainly not how he'd taught a town something about the kind of heroes who don't chase glory, but instead choose to stay. Earlier that week, the county judge had delivered her ruling. Judge Helen Granger was a tall woman in her late 50s with graying curls and sharp, perceptive eyes. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her deep belief in second chances. Wearing her usual charcoal robe and silver-rimmed glasses, she had reviewed the reports from social services, the community statements, and Ellie's personal testimony. Her final decision was clear: Ellie would retain custody of Noah at Shelterwood under community supervision, with support from Walter Brennan and legal guardianship oversight temporarily held by Deputy Mark Collier. Ellie hadn't cried in court. She'd sat straight-backed in a plain blouse, her hands folded over Noah's blanket in her lap. But afterward, outside the courthouse, she had whispered to Mark, "It doesn't feel real yet." Mark, ever a man of few words, simply replied, "Then let's make it real." So they had. Back at Shelterwood that evening, the snow had just begun falling again. Ellie stood at the nursery window, holding Noah close to her chest. She rocked him gently, her chin resting against his soft crown, humming the same tune she used to sing in the bakery during early shifts. It was a slow, tender lullaby with no words, just a melody that had lived in her since childhood, taught by a mother she hadn't spoken to in years. Noah's eyelids fluttered. A tiny yawn escaped him, followed by the sweet, hiccuping breath of surrendering to sleep. Beneath the crib, as always, lay Shadow. The old dog had not missed a night since Ellie returned. His body curled protectively toward the crib, his eyes half closed but always aware. The collar Mark had made still hung proudly around his neck. Sometimes he would raise his head to nuzzle the crib's leg. Sometimes he would simply listen. On the wall above the changing table hung a framed crayon drawing. A large black and tan dog under a full white moon, lying watchful beneath a wooden crib. The lines were unsteady, the colors uneven, but the heart behind it pulsed strong. At the bottom of the picture, in small but careful handwriting, were the words. Some heroes don't need to speak. They just stay. Ellie had drawn it herself, quietly one afternoon after a nap, using a box of crayons Leah had left out for the older children. It wasn't meant to be art. It was a truth she needed to put somewhere visible. A truth about love. And staying. And listening. Mark leaned against the doorframe now, watching the scene, mother, child, dog, and quiet warmth. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his badge absent, his posture relaxed. He spoke not to her, not even really to the room, more to the space between what had been and what was now. Not because it was your duty. Just because your heart knew where love was needed. Shadow shifted slightly. The crib creaked. Noah sighed. And Ellie, without turning, replied, "That goes for you too, Mark." They said nothing more. In the quiet that followed, the room held something sacred. A kind of breathless calm, the calm of battles not just survived, but transformed. Ellie no longer trembled when she held Noah. Walter now came by each Wednesday to read aloud from picture books in his gravelly voice. Even Sarah had sent a knit blanket, the same warm teal color as the ribbon she always wore in her hair. Outside, the town lights glimmered against the snow. The plaque at the library caught the moonlight, its words glowing just faintly through the frost. Back inside, the old radiator hummed softly as the night deepened. No longer a shelter of sorrow, Shelterwood had become what its name had always promised, a place to begin again. The final lesson of this story isn't in the first bark, or the last embrace, it's in a quiet choice, to stay, when others walk away. In a world that moves fast, where everyone's rushing forward, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit beside someone and simply listen, not out of duty, but because your heart knows where love is needed. Real life is no different. You may not find a baby in the snow, but you might hold on to a small promise, reach out to someone silently hurting, or simply not turn away when someone needs to be believed in. If Shadow's story touched you, even just a little, share it, so hope can travel further. Hit like to honor those quiet, unseen acts of love. Subscribe to the channel to join us for more stories like this. And leave a comment below, when was the last time you stayed for someone else? We'd love to hear your story.